Hey, good afternoon. The clock at Emmanuel Church just struck 1, so I guess it's time to get this live stream started. I am in Chestertown, Maryland today. So Chestertown is on the eastern shore of Maryland. So the eastern shore of Maryland is on the east bank of the Chesapeake Bay, and it forms a peninsula with the Chesapeake Bay on one side and the Atlantic Ocean on the other side. So coming down from Delaware into a section of Maryland, and then a small section of Virginia down at the bottom of the peninsula. That's how the peninsula gets its name, the Delmarva Peninsula, from Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and that's where we are today. These counties out here, these Maryland counties, are some of the least populated counties in the state. They are predominantly agricultural counties, a lot of soybeans, wheat, maize, chickens, and these are also counties for watermen. So Maryland crab fishery, very important out on this side of the Chesapeake Bay. And then also on the Atlantic side, we've got beach resorts like Ocean City, Maryland, and Bethany and Rehoboth, Delaware. And then if you go further down, you get Assateague Island, Chincoteague Island with the ponies, and down into Virginia. If you're thinking of where it's located in terms of large towns or facilities, Dover, Delaware, the state capital, of course Dover Air Force Base. What else is down here that people may have heard of? The NASA Wallops Flight Center. So rocket launchers from this side of the Chesapeake Bay. But yeah, so that's where we are today. Chestertown, Maryland, capital or county seat, of Kent County. Dating back to the colonial era, Chestertown was founded chartered in 1706 as the county seat. At that time, that right there, that's the old county courthouse. The original one burned down in, I think, 1707, so pretty quickly after they established this as a county seat, the courthouse burned down. This one dates from, this may be the third one, I think. This dates from Victorian era, with a little bit of modern remodeling, but still in use as a facility. Just on the other side of the square here, that is Emmanuel Episcopal Church. So when the American Revolution broke out in earnest, the Emmanuel Church here in Chestertown was still then regarded as a Church of England church. And this was the church here in Chestertown that Episcopal ministers met at and decided they were no longer going to call themselves the Church of England. They were going to call themselves, I believe, the Episcopal Church of the Americas, or the Episcopal Protestant Church of the Americas. Anyway, that's how in the Anglican Communion, Episcopalianism in the United States, simultaneous or contiguous, or what is the word I'm searching for? Comparable to the Church of England back in England. So same doctrine, same belief, but a break with the national English church and the establishment of an independent American church. So Chestertown's significant in history and from that religious point of view for colonial history, Revolutionary War history, and American religious history. That's not why I'm out here today. I'm here to talk about the Chestertown Tea Party, 1774, and the Chestertown Resolves, some proclamations that were published also in the May of that year. So a little bit of historical context. We're talking about the period before the Declaration of Independence and before the Revolutionary War. So all the events in the lead up to that you will remember from elementary school, so probably 5th grade, or Schoolhouse Rock if you're old enough to remember Schoolhouse Rock. We're talking about the period in which the French and Indian War has ended, so ends in 1763. So the 7 Years' War has ended. French and Indian War has ended. It's known as the French and Indian War here in the United States or in the Americas because that's predominantly who the fighting is against. French Canada and its Native American First Nation allies, like particularly the Huron. So we know that story from obviously elementary school history and romanticizations such as Last of the Mohicans, whether you've read the novel or whether you've watched the Daniel Day-Lewis movie. So that war has ended. Now in America, that was in the American colonies, in the 13 colonies, that was a significant event in which colonial militias participated on behalf of the British Crown fighting against the French and Indians. So that's where George Washington, as a commander of the Virginia militia, it's going to be a noisy day today. I think they're doing roadworks across the way. This is where George Washington, is an officer in the Virginia militia, established his military bona fides. But you have to remember, this was not just the French and Indian War. This was a global world war, known around the rest of the world, or known to historians as the 7 Years' War, lasted 7 years. So there was conflict here in the American colonies, but there was also conflict in mainland Europe. There was conflict on the high seas, and there was even conflict as far away as India, the Indian colonies, such as Bengal and Madras, and the French colonies of Pondicherry. So this is a global war that involves Britain and France, and Britain's colonies, and France's colonies in Canada, but it also involves Prussia and Austria and Russia, and there are huge land battles such as Minden in mainland Europe. So it was a global this could be well, this could be fun. Let's see how often that occurs. If it does, I'm going to move that way. So this was a global world war in which Britain participated, and Britain accrued huge national debt, fighting not only in the Americas, not only in Europe, on mainland Europe with an army, not only in the high seas, the Royal Navy being a predominant navy in the world, but also effectively the British conquest of India with the Battle of Plassey and things like that. So British expenditure during that war was phenomenal. The national debt doubled in size. The national debt was £72 million, which was a lot of money back then. It almost doubled in size. £129 million it increased to, which, you know, was a phenomenal amount of money then. And there go my notes. So I'm going to have to chase those notes down because I do not want to litter the courthouse square and incur a fine for littering. Excuse me. I'm going to see how unprofessional we can make this tour today by jumping up and down. So the national debt had increased to £129 million. In today's money, that's about $25 billion, so a significant sum. So Britain was bankrupt, it had huge debts, and it needed to repay those debts and also to finance now its standing armies, which it had to keep in its colonies to continue to protect those colonies. So the French and Indian War had ended. The British needed to maintain a military presence in the American colonies to prevent against Native American intrusion, such as Pontiac's War, which broke out pretty soon afterwards. Potential conflict with Spain, because Spain has now occupied Florida as a Spanish colony down there. There could be conflict with Spain in the future. Potential further conflict with France, who owns Caribbean colonies. So in the Americas, they have to maintain a military presence, which will require troops on the ground and an American naval squadron. It also has to now produce or have and fund troops in the colonies seized in India, and it has to maintain a strong enough army at home to intervene in the mainland Europe if it has to intervene in mainland Europe. So Britain has these debts, and it's going to pay them, but it's going to pay them by taxing people, the way that governments don't generate revenue. Governments tax citizens, and then they spend that money on what the government wants to spend the money on. So in this case, they're paying down war expenses. One of the places that they're going to tax, obviously, is England, Scotland, Ireland, so the home countries. They're going to tax those people because they've already been taxed and they will continue to be taxed. But they're looking for new ways and new sources of revenue to tax. And one of those sources of revenue, I am going to displace just slightly, walk through the courthouse square here. One of those places that they're going to tax are the 13 American colonies. So from the point of view of the British government, there's just been this war in which the British government and the Crown and the British military has defended the American colonies, but the American colonies have not paid a penny towards the defence of the colonies. Obviously excluding the fact and ignoring the fact that the colonies had raised substantial numbers of militia, and those American provincial militias had actually fought in those conflicts. But the British government's attitude is, we're defending the American colonies, and the American colonies are not paying tax revenue to us for their defence, so let's tax the American colonies. So there's no income tax in those days, so income tax is out of the question. Just walking around to a quieter corner of the courthouse thing. I'm out front of the 1860s courthouse now. Circuit Court building, still the Circuit Court of Kent County today. So the attitude of the British government, as I said, is that the American colonies have not paid tax, and they're going to be taxed. And as I said, there's no such thing as income tax. That's not been invented yet. Oh, imagine that, a world without income tax. Wouldn't that be marvellous? But so taxes are typically now excises and tariffs, so duties on things. So we talk about excises and tariffs today in global trade. We may impose tariffs on Canadian wood. We may impose tariffs on French wine. So those imports to the United States may have a tariff imposed upon the person importing them. There's also things that we pay when you're paying that liquor tax, because a bottle of liquor costs a certain amount of money, but a good chunk of that is actually tax on liquor, so that's an excise duty. So that's the way that traditionally governments in this period had raised government revenue, through tariffs and excise. And so the British government decides that it will extend some of these and invent some new ones for the American colonies. So the Stamp Act, for example, in which any official publication, any official business, such as a deed, a will, a business contract, a newspaper, a book, anything like that has to have a stamp affixed to it and pay a stamp tax towards the government's finances. And then there are other imposed taxes. We're talking about really the Townshend Acts, which I think is a series of 5 different acts which are going to tax different things that are being imported to the colonies, and also will impose maybe some tariffs on American goods that are being exported back to Britain, will also be taxed. So this is the first time that the American merchant class has really been taxed. So in the British system of course has the monarchy, the nobility, a parliament, of really predominantly an upper middle class gentry, so landowners, lawyers, etc., and then ordinary people that work farms and work in industry. So, but in the United States, in these 13 colonies, you have royal governors who act on behalf of the crown, and then the political class here, there is no nobility. So the political class, the political nation in the 13 colonies is its merchant and educated class. So it's the literate, numerate merchant class, lawyers, planters. So this is how people like Thomas Jefferson, an attorney, or George Washington, a large landowner and farmer, people like that form the political nation in the 13 colonies. So it's not individual small farmers eking out a subsistence on a small family farm up on the New York frontier. We're talking about an established, I guess what you describe as a bourgeoisie, I suppose, in classical terms, lawyers, doctors, landowners, etc., etc., clergymen that are the intellectual force and the political governing force in the country. And this is the first time that they are being taxed by the British Crown, and they do not like it. The reason they don't like it is because, yes, they can send in Maryland, you can send a delegate to the provincial legislature in Annapolis. If you're in Virginia, you can send somebody to the provincial government in Williamsburg. But they really act as advisory bodies to the governors who are subject to the Crown and rule and direction from England. So although there's a participatory democracy of a sort, the powers of those provincial legislatures are very, very limited compared to the British Parliament. If the British Parliament passes a law that says in the 13 colonies this will happen, then that will happen. There's nothing those provincial governments can do to overturn British law passed in England. And they do not have any representatives in the British Parliament. The British Parliament is comprised of members of the House of Lords, so nobility. They sit in the House of Lords on those fancy red benches. And in the House of Commons, which we now see those like fancy green leather benches, those are members of Parliament elected in Britain. Obviously, we're talking about the 18th century, the 1700s, so the democratic process, there's no secret ballot, only rich landowners can vote, women cannot vote, servants cannot vote. So, but anyway, there's elections, and there are elected members of Parliament from towns and counties in England and Scotland and Ireland, but none from the American colonies. So the American colonies are now being taxed without their direct consent and without any say in the legislative process and the democratic process which created those taxes. So that's the situation that you find yourself in at the end of that 7 Years' War period, so in the late 1760s and early 1770s. One of the most particular noxious taxes, and it seems absurd when you think about it, is over tea. Now, tea is a staple drink around the world, imported from China and India, and it was becoming a staple drink in Britain and also in the 13 colonies. So Britain's still today famous as a nation of tea drinkers. I'm sitting in Maryland, which I guess is famous as a state of people who drink sweetened iced tea during the summer, which to me as an Englishman born and bred seems strange and barbaric maybe, but anyway. So tea. People in the colonies drink tea because coffee's not a big trade yet, chocolate's not a big trade yet, so tea is considered to be a luxury import, sign of status that you're drinking tea in the same way that people are drinking tea in London, and you want to keep up with the fashion. You want to keep up with the European fashion, so in the Americas they're drinking tea, and lots of tea. There's a monopoly on tea from the East India Company that is the chartered company that is administering the British colonies on the Indian subcontinent. So it's a private company that's been pretty much outsourced. The British government has outsourced management of the Indian colonies to a private company who make a huge amount of money from their trade monopolies. And one of their trade monopolies is tea. Tea from India, tea from China. So it's a huge trade monopoly for them, and they make a lot of money out of it. So they make a lot of money out of importing that to the United Kingdom and to the Netherlands and to other countries in mainland Europe. And they also make a lot of money importing that to the United States, where people want to buy tea and drink tea. So the British government comes up with this great idea as one of these Townshend Acts. It will tax tea imports. So when you arrive in 13 colonies, in say the port of Boston or the port of Charleston, and you arrive with a merchant ship loaded with cases of tea in its hold, it has to land, it has to be inspected by customs officers, Crown customs officers, who will then impose an excise tax on that tea. The tax has to be paid before that tea can be handed on to the merchant that is purchasing the tea. So the Crown is, first of all, it has a monopoly with the East India Company. There's only one group allowed to ship this tea, and then the government is then taxing the tea before anybody can buy it. And this causes huge controversy because it's something that's regarded as taxing tea. I mean, that'd be like now, if you'd never taxed a Kit Kat or you'd never taxed a can of soda, that you're now gonna tax your candy bar and tax your can of pop, which you'd be like, what are you doing? Why have I got to pay a special tax on a Kit Kat bar? That's ridiculous. And so they have the same attitude. It's like, you making us pay tax on tea? That's crazy. Let's not do this. And then they think, well, we can't stop this from happening because we have no say in the lawmaking process. And so you can see how we're now stepping up to that whole idea of taxation without representation, and how that will become a focal point for American colonists. And when the American patriotic societies such as the Sons of Liberty form and corresponding societies form, this is what's being discussed at those meetings. We're being taxed, but we have no representation. This is unfair. Either the Crown has to give us representation in the British Parliament, or it has to give us control over taxation here in the colonies, or we're going to have a problem. So the problem does continue. The British government, being essentially a government of fools at this period, tries to continue with its taxes. This leads us to an event in December 1773, which you will remember from your school history lesson, and you will remember from Schoolhouse Rock. December 1773, Boston Tea Party. So members of the Sons of Liberty, a patriotic organisation, disguise themselves as Native Americans. Not very well. I mean, they just put feathers in their hair and say, like, hey, I'm not really Sam Adams, I'm really a Native American. Don't think I'm Sam Adams. Anyway, they go down to the harbour in Boston. There are ships there carrying tea. They do not want to pay the duty on the tea, so they break onto the ships. They bring up the crates of tea from the hold, and they start tipping tea into Boston Harbour. If you've tipped tea leaves into a teapot or into a teacup, not a tea bag, but like loose tea leaves, you'll know that they expand and they clog up. And will expand quite a lot of time. If you leave loose tea in a teapot with water, it will expand a phenomenal amount from those dried tea leaves as they rehydrate and steep. So imagine tipping crates of tea, not ounces of tea, not pounds of tea, but like hundreds of pounds in weight of tea into the harbour. So the tea is just floating on the surface and getting higher and higher in piles on the surface. It's an absolutely chaotic scene, absolute mess, absolute chaos. Now, the government is livid. The British government is livid when it hears of this, because the tax has not been paid. The customs officers in the port of Boston have not been able to recover that tax. The cargo has been destroyed, and I'll see if I've got my water bottle. Excuse me. I'm just going to do a hydration break because we're at temperatures. I'm sitting in the nice shade here, but temperatures are up in the 90s today here in Maryland. The first rule of being on a tour is water and hydrate. Or is that two rules? First two rules are water and hydrate and sitting in the shade. First three rules are water, hydrate, sitting in the shade, and a fanatical devotion to the Monty Python sketch. I'm getting off topic. So it's absolute chaos at the Boston Tea Party. Once news of the Boston Tea Party gets back to Britain, gets back to London, there's going to be a furore. There's going to be, what are we going to do? We've got to teach these people a lesson. But news doesn't just go back to London. News then spreads throughout the other 13 colonies. And one of the colonies that it spreads to, of course, is Maryland. And one of the places that it spreads to is here in Chestertown. So why Chestertown? Chestertown's still a small town. Less than 6,000 people live here. So that's a small town by, I think I live in a small town over in Aberdeen, Maryland. That's the proving ground, and that population is about 18,000, and that's considered a small town. So we're like, 3 times the size of Chestertown. So Chestertown, small population, less than 6,000 today. 1,500 of those are students at Washington College, 10th oldest college in the United States. It's taken its name now after General Washington. He bestowed his name on that college after the Revolutionary War. But one of the 10, I think the 10th oldest college in the original 13 colonies. So the population here is very small, and it was relatively small then because, as I said at the beginning, we're on the eastern shore, a predominantly agricultural area. But Chestertown is located on the Chester River, which is a tributary of the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay is huge. Look at a map of the east coast of America, find Washington DC, find Baltimore, find Wilmington, and whoosh, you've got this huge saltwater bay in the coastline, and that's the Chesapeake Bay. So it's a natural entrepot for ships coming into the Potomac, into the James going up to Richmond, into the Potomac going up to Maryland, further up the Chesapeake Bay to Annapolis, further up the Chesapeake Bay to what's going to become Baltimore, and then all the towns along the Chesapeake Bay that are going to become centres of trade and commerce, such as Crisfield further down the coast, and Chestertown here. Chestertown is one of 6 ports in the Maryland colony which is allowed to import and export directly from Britain. So if you're a small town, you can't import directly. You're going to have to import via Annapolis or via Chestertown or one of those. Chestertown is one of the only 6 ports that can receive a ship from London or Bristol or wherever, and also then ship product back, such as tobacco, typically from Maryland in this period, which is why down on the waterfront there is a customs house. So it's a centre of commerce, an important centre of commerce, even though it's a small town. And for that reason, this is a town in which you could import tea into. So there are 2 ways to get tea into the United States. One is that your ships are coming that are directly chartered, coming from the East India Company, and are bringing tea directly to the Americas. That's what was attacked at the Boston Tea Party, and that tea thrown overboard. But you could be a private merchant in a town like Chestertown, and you could purchase that tea. You could purchase East India tea and pay the tax in London, and then ship that with the other goods that you're importing directly here to Chestertown. So Chestertown is not receiving shipments of East India tea in big ships, but certainly smaller ships such as brigantines. So smaller ships will come up the Chester River and unload goods here, privately purchased and already taxed tea. So this brings us to the Boston Tea Party of December 1773, and the news has spread throughout the 13 colonies. The Sons of Liberty operate throughout the 13 colonies. There's an active chapter of the Sons of Liberty here in Chestertown and in Kent County, and they decide that the next shipment of tea that arrives at Chestertown, they're going to deal with it the same way that it was dealt with in Boston. Let's wait for this truck to pass. So in May of 1774, so the story goes, and we'll come back to so the story goes, but in May of 1774, so the story goes, brigantine, a small ship, crosses the Atlantic. It's called the Geddes, sails into the Chesapeake Bay, comes into the Chester River, comes to the port of Chestertown, and amongst the items on the Geddes is a cargo of tea. The story says that members of the Sons of Liberty, replicating the events of Boston just 6 months earlier, disguised themselves, board the Geddes, seized the cases of tea, and tipped them into the Chester River. That's the story. There is no newspaper record or document record of that event. It's not really mentioned. I don't believe it's mentioned until the 1890s in historical compendiums of like events that happened in Maryland in the colonial times, people writing books in the 1890s are saying like, oh yeah, there was a tea party in Chestertown. There was no newspaper here in Chestertown at the time. The nearest newspaper would be across the other side of the bay in Annapolis. That would be the Maryland Gazette. Through mergers, that newspaper is still in business today as the Capital Gazette over in Annapolis, Maryland. But the Maryland Gazette is the newspaper of record in the Maryland colony over in Annapolis. But there's no record in the Maryland Gazette that the Tea Party actually happened. Doesn't mean it didn't happen, because we have to accept oral tradition as part of the historical record, and then we can discuss the validity of that oral tradition and, you know, its provenance. But there's no paper trail on that tea party. What there's a paper trail on something called the Chestertown Resolves. So the Sons of Liberty met in Chestertown in May of 1774, and they held a meeting and they passed a series of resolutions, the Chestertown Resolves, these resolutions. And these resolutions would address their relationship with the Crown, so their relationship as subjects of King George III back in England. The resolutions would address the proprietary, the legalities of taxation without representation, and would pass resolutions on what patriotic Sons of Liberty should do with regard to that. Now, I'm never going to remember this from memory, which is why, as I said when I was chasing my notes across the courthouse square earlier, because I wanted to get a couple of them. There are 6 in total, but I wanted to get at least a couple of them word for word. So, get control of my camera. So, the Chestertown Resolves. So these are passed in May of 1774, so predating the Declaration of Independence in 1776 by 2 years. So here in Maryland, 2 years before the Declaration of Independence, the same kind of language in a shorter form, in perhaps a more succinct form, is addressing the same issues that are addressed in the reminiscences that are presented to the Crown and then the Declaration of Independence by the Continental Congress in 1776. So let's have a look at some of these resolutions. I'll read directly because I want to get the quote right. First, resolved that we acknowledge His Majesty King George III, King of Great Britain, France and Ireland. King of France, well, I guess they hadn't given up hopes they were going to recapture the territory lost by Queen Mary in the Tudor reign, but anyway. King of Great Britain, France and Ireland, to be our lawful sovereign to whom we owe and promise all dutiful allegiance and submission. So first off the bat, we are loyal. We are not committing an act of treason here. We are your loyal subjects. We owe you our allegiance. We owe you our dutiful submission. We love you, King George. You're just being misled, but we are loyal citizens. So they're getting that up front straight away, that they still consider themselves to be free-born Englishmen, exercising their rights as free-born Englishmen and as subjects of the Crown. They want to, and they say, we owe you our duty as subjects of the Crown, and by then implication, the Crown owes them duty as the Crown to its subjects. But they're getting that out of the way first, that they are not traitors. It is second resolved that no duty or taxes can be constitutionally imposed on us, but by our own consent, given personally or by our representatives. So there we are, right in the second resolve. Taxation with representation is fine. Taxation without representation, we don't like that, and we don't think that's constitutional, because we consider ourselves to be equals to people sitting in London, and if somebody in London can't be taxed without their consent, then somebody sitting in Chestertown, Maryland, or Annapolis, Maryland, or Philadelphia, or New York, or Charleston, or wherever, they should not be taxed without their consent. So that's that second resolution. Okay, moving on then. It's rapidly turning into a Mr. Boba chalks this on the board and everybody has to jot it down in their books. I'm sorry about that. So third resolved, that the Act of the British Parliament, so the 7th Parliament of George III, Part 46, that's the session that we're in, subjecting the colonies to a duty on tea for the purpose of raising revenue in America is unconstitutional, oppressive and calculated to enslave Americans. So we've said that taxation without representation is unconstitutional. Now we're going to pick this one law, this tax on tea. We're going to say, here's an example of something you've done which is unconstitutional. And as a result of that, you are... As a result of that, you are oppressing us, and strong language, you are enslaving us. Let's do the fourth one as well. So this is the resolution now. We've had the establishment that we are not committing an act of treason. We've had the resolution that says taxation without representation is something we do not appreciate. We've had a resolution that specifies an example of that. And now we have the actions required. Fourth resolved, therefore, that whoever shall import or in any way aid or assist in importing or introducing from any part of Great Britain or any other place, i.e. India, whatsoever into this town or country any tea subject to the payment of duty imposed by the aforesaid Act of Parliament, or whoever shall willingly sell, buy, consume, so you can't even drink it, in any way assist with the sale, purchase or consumption of any tea imported as the aforementioned subject will, continues, on the correct piece of paper, which I've now got out of order, shall be stigmatized as enemies of the liberties of America. So, whoever is importing tea, whoever is shipping tea, whoever is purchasing tea as the merchants, whoever is selling on the tea as a merchant at this end, whoever buys the tea, whoever drinks the tea, you are a bad person and we will stigmatize you. It doesn't say we're going to beat you to death with clubs, but you're certainly going to be shunned by your neighbours. You're going to be possibly catcalled in the street. You might be called out from the pulpit at church. People may refuse to trade with you. You may get a brick thrown through your window. Somebody may break into your warehouse and destroy your stock of tea. So you'll be stigmatized and you'll be considered an enemy to the liberties of America. So it's now stopped talking about being loyal citizens of King George and being Englishmen. It's now specifically talking about America, not the colony of Maryland. So not as we are citizens of Maryland, but as America as a whole. So the concept of America as a whole as a join or die, that cartoon published by Benjamin Franklin, that the colonies must join or die. Not a Revolutionary War slogan, but a cartoon published during the French and Indian War that says that if the colonies do not unite together and do not stand united together, these colonies, and we fight the French and Indian War together, that we could be picked off, like New York could be picked off and Virginia could be picked off one by the French and their allies. So that join or die concept, first introduced by Franklin, in which he's thinking the 13 colonies are independent colonies, but they also represent something whole. That's stated again here in the Chestertown Resolves in 1774, that notion of the 13 colonies being, we're here in Chestertown, Maryland, passing these resolutions about nobody should import tea into this town, but we also mention, excuse me, nobody should import tea into this country, and we talk about the concept of America as a thing, as a political entity, as a geographic entity, and as a political entity. These 13 colonies constitute something whole in together, and as they say, stand together or assuredly you will hang separately. So these are some of the takeaways then from the Chestertown Resolves, 1774, 2 years before the Declaration of Independence. 2 years and 2 months before the Declaration of Independence, because it's May 1774. So, where we're talking about taxation without representation, we're talking about the specific acts that the British government are imposing on the 13 American colonies. We are talking about how the 13 colonies do not like that and would like that to cease. And then we are talking about how we're starting to view those independent colonies as a political whole, and the concept of America that we think of today as the United States of America isn't just something that people came up with in a conference room in these debates in 1775 and 1776 in the Continental Congress. These were things that were being thought of by people around 13 colonies, including Maryland and including right here in Chestertown, years before and earlier than that these were things that were being thought of, and that the principle that you should not be taxed without your consent, still a principle today, that you should therefore have representation in the legislature. So that of course has developed over time. Originally, representation, as we know from American history, representation was initially white property owners, not extended to domestic servants, indentured labour, not extended to women, and certainly not extended to African slaves, of which Chestertown and Maryland had significant populations of slaves, because these tobacco plantations were very labour intensive. So thinking about that in particular, that Virginia and Maryland colonies between them, in the period before the importation of slaves was banned in 1807 by Act of Congress, so you couldn't legally, although an illegal trade and illegal importation continued for many years afterwards, but the legal importation of slaves ended in 1807. But in that period, up to 1807, Maryland and Virginia, this area, this tidewater tobacco growing area, had imported more American slaves than the other 11 colonies put together. So that's the importance of slavery to the Maryland and Virginia economies. Tobacco, if you know anything about tobacco farming, tobacco is an exhaustive plant. It exhausts the soil. It doesn't put many nutrients back into the soil, so it's killing your soil. So as Maryland drifted away from mass tobacco plantations towards, as you drive through Kent County today, you'll see wheat fields, soybean fields, and maize, Indian corn in particular. So as Maryland shifted its agriculture away from labour-intensive cotton to less labour-intensive agriculture, it still kept slavery. Maryland was a slave state at the beginning of the Civil War. So Maryland was a slave state until the 1860s, but Maryland in that period, I think I'm digressing a little bit, but I just like the story because of the reference, that Maryland became an exporter of slaves to other states. So, the Union had expanded, additional states had been added on after independence. So we're talking about predominantly the Cotton South, so the Alabamas and the Mississippis and, the Arkansas and the Cotton South, the Deep South, with those cotton plantations, and cotton being a labour-intensive crop that required slave labour to pick it, and also those being areas in which diseases such as malaria and yellow fever would carry off a population very quickly. Those states needed a ready supply of slaves, and Maryland essentially became a centre in which human beings were bred. I can't think of another word for it. Bred and sold. And the sheer horror of it, that you're born in Maryland as a slave, and then you're torn away from your family at a workable age, and you are sold down the Mississippi River to work in the Cotton South. Hence the term sold down the river. That term comes from Huck Finn, so we have Mark Twain to thank for that one. So the phrase being sold down the river comes from Huck Finn, where he's talking about the widow's slave not being sold down the river, which he meant that after the widow had died, the slave had not been sold to a cotton plantation down the Mississippi. So that's where that phrase comes from. And so anyway, I digressed a little bit into discussion of slavery in Maryland, but it's because doing a lot of research at the moment on Civil War in Maryland, and one of the notable things about Chestertown and the Eastern Shore, this Eastern Shore we're on in particular, I think at least 5 regiments of United States colored troops were raised on the Eastern Shore during the Civil War. And here in Chestertown, at least 400 black Americans volunteered for service in the United States colored troops during the Civil War. So Maryland was a slave state. You could not enlist a slave in the military. You had to be free man to be. You had to be a free man. So you had to be a free man in Maryland, or a slave from a state in rebellion. So you could join if you were a slave escaped from Virginia. But if you were a Marylander, you had to be a free man of color. Free. You couldn't be a slave. You had to be a free man of color to volunteer. Not conscripted. Volunteer. They were conscripting white men in this period, like off the boat in New York. You arrive from Ireland and you're off the boat and you're like, congratulations, here's $20 for your mum, and she's going to go live in some tenement at 5 points. You're now in the United States Army, off you go to fight. Black soldiers were volunteers, not conscripts, volunteers, and 400 men from here in Chestertown volunteered for service in United States colored troops, which is, that's just something I'm kind of like working through at the moment and researching. There's a beautiful memorial down here in Chestertown to United States colored troops, and we don't see many of those around. You often see Civil War memorials, but Chestertown is one of the few that actually has a memorial to US colored troops. So anyway, that's the story of the Chestertown Resolves, these important political documents. Google them, they're online, you can pull them up, so it's primary source. Certainly good for your kids if you're from Maryland and your kid's doing a 5th grade report next year on the War of Independence and the American Revolution, and you're thinking, wouldn't it be great to get like a Maryland story into this? Well, now you can tell your kid all about the Chestertown Resolves and how locally here in Maryland that idea of no taxation without representation and the idea of America as a thing was thought of here in Maryland in 1774, 2 years before the Declaration of Independence in 1776. So that's a great thing. And of course, as a primary source document, that's also useful for your high school students, those of you that are doing AP US History, God love you, do it. That's one less college class you've got to take. AP US History, Maryland Resolves are something that you can talk about. It's probably not going to be one of the documents presented to you in a DBQ, but when you're working in your answer and you want to work in a little bit of additional information that sort of like shows, oh hey, I did use the information in the DBQ, but I also just want to drop in a couple of extra facts to show how much I know about the subject. You can just sneak that little bit in of like, there was this thing called the Chestertown Resolves in 1774 where they discussed taxation without representation. So that was the process of the tour. As I said, this idea of there being a tea party here, that's a great story. They celebrate it every year. Memorial Day weekend, there is a tea party celebration here in downtown Chestertown where historical reenactors and living history people come to do a historical reenactment of a Revolutionary War battle, of which there was none here, but they come anyway and put on a good show, send off some fireworks, living history people walk around portraying citizens from the period. They may discuss the Chestertown Resolves. They'll read the Chestertown Resolves out, and then they'll do some reenactment of a tea party down at the waterfront, probably using the Sultana. They have a reconstructed sailing ship here, which is run by an educational trust. Your school kids can take trips on it and sail up and down the Chesapeake Bay, and so they have this little ship that can be dressed up as a merchantman or as a small warship, I guess, and they reenact the tea party from there. So whether or not there's a historical record, a paper trail for that tea party, no, but it's certainly an oral history that's been passed down to modern tradition, and it's easy to dismiss oral history and oral tradition as, well, there's no paper record, so let's ignore it. But there's a basis to those. I mean, there are some cultures without a written record, and the only way that we can accept their history is through oral history. So it's something to consider, that it might be a legend, but it's a damn good legend, it's a damn good story, and they put on a good show here on Memorial Day. So if you're in the area, if you're in the Maryland area or the Delaware area, this is a nice place to visit. It's a nice little town. Some beautiful old historic buildings, red brick buildings from the colonial era, down along the waterfront. The old courthouse is here, the old Emmanuel church is here, the old customs house is still here. There are restaurants, cafes, beautiful used bookstore selling lovely, good condition old historical books. There's the college you can walk around, Washington College. So come on down. It's on a bit of a back road, but if you follow that back road down, you can drive all the way down the peninsula. If you want to, from the Delaware line up where Wilmington is, all the way down through Delaware on windy roads, into Maryland on windy roads, and then all the way down the peninsula. If you want to go across to the Atlantic coast and hit those beaches and those beach towns, you can do that. If you want to visit the NASA Visitor Center at Wallops Island, you can do that. If you want to go see Misty Chincoteague, or however you pronounce that, Virginia Island, I'm probably going to get criticized by some Virginia native about that, but anyway, go see those wild ponies. Drive all the way down to the tip, the Virginia tip. The Virginia county's right at the bottom of the peninsula. Go through the tunnel and you pop up at Hampton Roads. So nice place to visit, and come on out and do that. So hope you enjoyed the little bit of Revolutionary War, pre-Revolutionary War American history today. I will be walking around the town a little bit more this afternoon, taking some photographs, some additional snips of video that I will be posting online. I hope you enjoyed the tour today. Pay attention on the Facebook page, so facebook.com/walkingtheground, one word. Lots of other stuff coming up. We'll be doing some watch parties of movies, so I'll post a link to an online movie that we can watch at a set time and discuss in the comments or tweets or whatever, however we want to do that, or just watch the movie for your own fun on your own time. We're getting out to Gettysburg again, we're getting out to Antietam again. We're doing some lunchtime tours, some short, 30, 45-minute tours. So if you're sitting at your desk eating a sandwich and you're like, would like something to listen to, forget your podcast, don't listen to your podcast, tune into a 30-minute, 45-minute little chat about Hawkins Suaves at Antietam or something like that. So we're getting out to those battlefields for some free live streams at lunchtime, and we're doing some free evening, afternoon live streams as well, where we'll be out on battlefields. We'll get some battlefield coffee, some good strong battlefield coffee in the reenactor mug. Those of you that have been on the tours before, you'll see my tin 32-ounce mug. Get some strong coffee in that, and we'll be out on the battlefields in the evening doing a battlefield coffee clutch, and we'll discuss where we are, what's going on, and little bits of some history from where we are, and also events in the that have come up during the week in the world of history. So thanks for watching. I appreciate all the support that you guys give me. I'm trying to do as many of these as I can for free, get out and about for you, put the video up online, up on Facebook. I'm trying to get some up on YouTube as well now for a more permanent record. If you like what I do, just click like, or just send me a message saying thanks, Really appreciate that feedback. If I'm annoying you, let me know. If there's something that you'd like to see, let me know. So if I'm out at Gettysburg again and you're like, I'd really like to see this monument, or I'd really like to see this, this statue, or my great-great-grandfather fought with this unit, do you know where they were on the field? Let me know. I'll go look that stuff up for you. Happy to do so. So if you like what I'm doing, just click on like on the Facebook page or on the YouTube page. Follow me on Twitter at WalkingGround. Drop me an email at walkingtheground@gmail.com, and stay in touch. Tune in for subsequent tours and events, and I'll see you around. Thanks for tuning in today.